Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. Today's guest is DANY NOBUS, clinical psychologist, psychoanalyst, and former chair of the Freud Museum London. His main research interests include the history, theory, and practice of psychoanalysis, the history of psychiatry, and the intersections between psychoanalysis, philosophy, and the arts. In 2017, Dr. Nobus was awarded the Sarton Medal of the University of Ghent for his outstanding contributions to the history of psychoanalysis.
Well, I came to psychoanalysis via psychology, which sounds a bit weird, given that there's hardly any psychoanalysis in psychology. And I'm not a young man anymore. So the same was true back in the early 1980s when I studied psychology. But I mean, look, I'd read some Freud, I'd read Jung, I'd read a whole bunch of different things during my teens, looking for ideas and trying to find some intellectual bearings, I think. And in the end, I studied psychology because I thought, it would bring me close to some of the people's works I'd read during my teens. And it wasn't just Freud. As I said, it was Freud, Jung, actually, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh and quite a few other people. But disillusioned I was, and that's an understatement, frustrated, angry, and disappointed I was when I discovered that in my first year of psychology, I didn't hear anything about the people I'd come to know and appreciate during my teens. I heard a lot about statistics, and I heard a lot about cognitivists and developmentalists, but I didn't hear anything about all the others. So I was very close to dropping out at the end of the first year, and to do something radically different, like physics or chemistry. And then a friend of mine said, well, you need to wait until the second year because there's a bunch of people here who do talk about Freud. And there's even a guy who talks about Lacan. And I'd never ever heard of Lacan because I had not come across Lacan during my teens. And what I'm going to say is totally embarrassing. But the first time I wrote down Lacan in a notebook, because apparently, I had to read him alongside Freud, I wrote down Lacamp. Right, so I misspelt Lacan, and obviously couldn't find him because I'd misspelled him. But I thought, okay, I'll give it another shot, and so lo and behold, in my second year, there was this professor who is dead now. He died a couple of years ago in his early 80s, with the rather funny name of Julian Quackelbein. and that is as funny in Flemish and Dutch as it is in English, trust me. And this guy had trained as an educational scientist and then subsequently became a Rogerian and then became a Jungian. But a couple of years before I studied psychology, he'd discovered or rediscovered Freud and Lacan, which I was still spelling as Lacamp. But it was the kind of stuff that I wanted to know and hear about, and because he had discovered it quite recently, he taught it with a certain degree of excitement and enthusiasm, as you would if you've newly discovered someone whose works you like. So we were not just exposed to the theory, we were also exposed to the professor's own exhilarated and how should I put it? Youthful enthusiasm, and I could say, and the rest is history. But of course it isn't. So I can tell you more.
Please do.
Well, my first real. And I'm using real here in the Lacanian sense. My first real exposure to Lacan was when I picked up a copy of Écrit, which, as Belgians, we were not supposed to read in English. And mind you, this was way before Bruce Sphinx's translation was available. We did have Alan Sheridan's translation of the selected Écrit, but we were supposed to read it in French, because if you're Belgian, you're supposed to be bi or even trilingual. So I will never forget the day that I picked up my copy of Écrit. And I opened it, and I read the first line of the seminar on the Purloined Letter. So I skipped the introduction, as whatever, I just go straight to the first essay, and I couldn't understand a single word. But as we say in French, or what I said to my friends at the time in France, je n'y comprends rien, mais ça me plaît. Right? I don't understand a single word, but I like it. Which was exactly the opposite to the experience I had when I read, because I had to read, Eysenck and Piaget and some of the other. Skinner, you know them. You did psychology, so you know them. It was exactly the opposite, because when I read Skinner, Piaget, I mean, you can't put them all in the same bag, but when I read the mainstream psychologists, the experience I had was, well, I do understand everything they say, but I don't like any of it. So with Lacan, I didn't understand anything, but I liked it. And the reason why I liked it's because, the notions, what he was talking about, because I could figure that out. The man was talking about desire and fantasy and subjectivity. It kind of resonated with what I thought was. Or what I thought, not just psychoanalysis, but the study of the human mind should be about, right? So that's how it all started, and then I got a bit more interested in it, and so thankfully we were given the opportunity. By virtue of Julian Quackelbein, but also by virtue of Paul Verhaag, who is still very much around, of course, and who was also teaching us, because he's a good 10 years older than me, and so he had already been appointed as an assistant professor in the department. So by virtue of a small group of people, I was given the opportunity to major, I think we would say in English, in psychoanalysis as part of my psychology degree. But had it not been for that, I can honestly say that I may not be here talking to you today, because I may have ended up becoming a physicist or a chemist or something like that.
And this is at Ghent University, or?
Yeah, so this is at Ghent University, and that's another story. I went to Ghent University because the only real alternative again in the Lacanian sense of the only impossible alternative, would have been me going to the Catholic University of Leuven. And those are not the two universities in Belgium. I mean, we have more universities than that. But if you go through secondary education in Belgium, and now situation is slightly different, and you come out with good grades, then basically the options are twofold, maybe threefold, but there aren't that many options. So you either go to Ghent, or you go to Leuven, or you go to Brussels. But for me, it was either Ghent or Leuven. And I didn't want to go to Leuven. I should say Leuven, because Leuven is one of those institutions that during the early 1970s it's very Lacanian, you see. It was split in the middle, and they created a Flemish-speaking and a French-speaking university. So I would have gone to the Katholieke Universiteit Leuven. But I think you already understood as to why I didn't want to go there, right? So I'd spent 12 years of my life already in a Catholic boys' school, and mind you, it wasn't nearly as bad as some people thought it was. But I had enough, I had enough of Catholic education. And probably I may have been exposed to psychoanalysis in Leuven as well, because there were people in Leuven in the theology department. Not so much in the psychology department, but in the theology department. People like Antoine Vergoot, for example, who taught psychoanalysis and Lacan. But I didn't want to go to Leuven because it was Catholic. And so I went to Ghent, which was also better practically, because I come from a very working class background. I think it was the first person in my family. Well, I know I'm the first person in my family, but I think I'm probably the first person in a very long generation of people carrying my name going to university. And so it was practical, because it meant that I could commute on a daily basis between Bruges, where I was born and where I grew up, and the University of Ghent. So my parents did not have to worry about the financial aspect, and but I had enough of Roman Catholicism, basically. Now, I assume that, much like me, at one point you were exposed to Freud and maybe a bit of Jung, because otherwise you wouldn't have picked it up, I assume. But if I hadn't been exposed to Freud, and I should tell you that I was never exposed to Jung throughout my degree course, because there weren't any Jungians around. I mean, there were Rogerians and there were there were professors who were into systemic therapy. So I did learn a lot about, and it was not uninteresting. I did learn a lot about Václavic and Jay Haley and Gregory Bateson, but there was no Jung. But I assume, I don't want to interview you now, that at one point they did cross your path, no?
Yeah, but I really don't know how. I tried to remember how people were like, when did you start reading Freud Jung? And it was like sometime in high school, like when I was a teenager. But I don't remember like how I came across them. It must have just been like in the psychology section of a bookstore or something. I must have just picked it up or heard of them from media, or I can't remember a particular person introducing them to me.
No, but I meant at university. There must have been someone at university.
There's no Jungians. No
Freudians.
Well, in grad school. In undergrad, no.
Right.
And then I went to graduate school. I got a PsyD, so it's a doctorate in psychology. And I thought it would be more eclectic, because I just assumed that everyone understood that, behavioral therapies and cognitive behavioral therapies weren't like everything. Like, of course, this isn't I see how this is a useful tool, but of course this isn't how humans function, like, as a whole. I just assumed that everyone knew that.
Yeah.
As my naive 20-something-year-old self. And then when I went to school, there was all behavioral and cognitive behavioral, but there was 2 analysts that were from New York that had retired in Florida. And they, like, had office space at the university and, like, taught, like, a couple of electives just to, like, have the office there and, you know, keep doing their research. So thank God for them, because I took all the classes that they offered while I was there, which I think total was maybe 6. And then for one of my rotations, for one of my externships, apparently the school I went to used to have a psychoanalytic program where they actually trained analysts. And there was someone who had been trained at this school as a psychoanalyst and ended up working at a hospital. And then he ran an externship at the local city hospital for students. And so I took a class with him, and it was a pharmacology class, but he was talking about pharmacology. He was, like, looking at all these different lenses of how to look at a person, and it was, like, the closest thing that I had gotten to anyone who wasn't just, like, super behavioral, even though it was a pharmacology class. So I just kind of followed him to his externship, and then I ended up working in hospitals for years, because then I had an externship at a hospital, so who's going to give me a different kind of position? So I completely sidetracked my career for a little while, but then once I got to New York, I did psychoanalytic training in the evenings after working at the hospital.
So I can't remember exactly whether I picked up Freud from the psychology section of my local library, but what I can remember is that Freud wrote a lot about sex, and that the books about sex that had the name of Freud on them were not inaccessible to me when I was about 14 years old, because probably because the librarian had made a mistake or didn't know himself that there was so much sex in Freud. But the library had this classification system, you see. I mean, this is the library equivalent to the British Board of Film classification. So they put stickers on each book, right? And some stickers would say readable by everyone. And some stickers would say parental guidance in Flemish. And some stickers would say only to be read by people over the age of 16. And then there were books only to be read over the age of 18. And then there were books with a purple sticker that were not accessible to anyone, right? But we might talk about them later. But yeah, probably because of the librarian's ignorance, the Freud had, I think, a parental guidance sticker, but it meant that if you were 14, you could actually borrow it. Which was not the case for Masters and Johnson, which is the one I was really interested in. Human sexual behavior, or the Kinsey reports, for example. So you can say, it's my youthful sexual curiosity that that drove me to Freud, and the fact that he had not been stigmatized by the sticker that would have prevented me from accessing him. There you go, and ditto with Jung. But there's less sex in Jung than there is in Freud, obviously, right?
Yeah, that's a great way to get into Freud. I might start using that, actually.
So the first thing I read by Freud was obviously the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. And obviously, because it also happened to be the first essay in the book, sexual perversion. I mean, I can say it was not my fault that it was the first essay in the book. It just happened to be the first essay in the book. So there you go, yeah. But Lacan was just not available. It's not that Lacan was off limits. It was not available.
There was no Lacan in my graduate school at all. I didn't even hear about Lacan until I went to New York.
Yeah, but
I was 30.
It wasn't even in the library. I mean, I don't think it was available. I didn't see it, and that's why I wrote it LACAMP, and then obviously.
Where do you think the P came from?
Oh no, because no, no, because when you say in French Lacan, you can spell it LACAMP. So had his name been LACAMP, you would have pronounced it in exactly the same way, right? Lacan. But I didn't know that. Right. What else do you want to know?
How did you end up in London?
Oh, well, how much time have you got? Pull factors and push factors. So after I graduated with my psychology degree in psychoanalysis, because I have a mainstream degree in clinical psychology. That's what it says on my degree certificate, because psychology is 5 years of full-time study, and I'll forget about these silly 3-year degrees here in the UK. So it was a 5-year full-time degree that is now, because of the Bologna Agreement, basically the equivalent of a bachelor's and a master's degree in the UK. And so I graduated with a degree in clinical psychology, but with a major in psychoanalysis. And then, well, I needed to decide what I was going to do with my life. Like so many kids, I guess, at that age. And but in a sense, the Belgian state had already decided that before me. And that was a mixed blessing, because when I graduated, the Belgian state had decided that I had to go to the army, because we still had compulsory military service at that time. But I didn't want to go to the army. And that's not because I'm an utter total pacifist. It's because I thought the army was just going to be a complete waste of my time. I was already 5 years older, or I would have been 5 years older than all the other army recruits, right? And army service would have been 10 months, I think. And I just couldn't see it. I just could not see it. I haven't forgotten about your question. So I decided to apply to be recognized as a conscientious objector, which in practice was actually much more difficult than it sounds. But I won't tell you the whole story. The upshot was that I ended up working for 2 years without earning any money at all, at the university, in the department where the likes of Paul Verhaag were teaching. So I managed to wriggle myself as a conscientious objector into that department. And then I didn't have to finish the 2 years, because during those 2 years, the Belgian state abolished compulsory military service, and so suddenly my status was also abolished. And then I had the opportunity to become a part-time research assistant there. So I applied for that, but it was only part-time. It was only 40%. So it didn't really allow me to make a living. But what it did allow me to do was to get a master's degree, and to start doing a PhD. So there was a point in my life, and I really don't know how I did it really, apart from the fact when you're that age, I don't recall ever feeling tired really. So I worked at the university. I did a PhD, and I also worked as a human resources manager in DHL, because I had to earn some money. Right. And so I did all that for about 6-7 years of my life. And then I was fed up. I wasn't fed up with Belgium as such, but I was fed up with the university system, and I was fed up with the department. And the main reason is that it wasn't a meritocracy. Now, I don't consider myself, I never have considered myself to be a particularly clever person, but in order to get a job at the university, you needed to know people, or you needed to carry the right political cards. So it was by no means the case at the time. Now it's different now, that people's applications were judged on the basis of what they had achieved, or on the basis of whatever their potential would be. And I thought to myself, well, I'm never going to be able to get a job here, because I didn't know anyone, and I was not even prepared to start schmoozing people in order to think that it might facilitate me getting a job. So I just started looking elsewhere, basically. And I started applying for various jobs, not just in the UK, but in other parts of Europe. Not in Belgium, obviously, because in Leuven it would have been the same. Actually, in Leuven it would have been worse, because I decided to go to the University of Ghent rather than to the University of Leuven. So it would have been unthinkable for them to appoint a lecturer, say, who had clearly at one point been an apostate and had, relinquished his Christian faith. But at that point in my life, I'd already started giving talks in various parts of Europe, because I become, and that's another story, a member of the École de la Cause Freudienne and the European School of Psychoanalysis. So that took us, by definition, to Paris every so often, but also to other parts of Europe. And I met someone in London here, whose name is Parveen Adams. She doesn't live too far from where I live, and she basically heard, because I told her that I was looking for a job, and she said, "Well, why don't you apply to Brunel University London? They might be interested in you." And so I applied, and I still don't know. I really don't know why they gave me the job, and the majority of my colleagues also don't know. I mean, they probably, well, actually, they've told me that it must have been a complete mistake, but I got the job. And so I've been there now for almost 25 years. And it was tough. It was incredibly tough. I mean, the first 6 months in London were just about the toughest months probably in my entire life, for all kinds of reasons. But it was tough. But I stayed, and now I still think that I just pack my bags and go somewhere else. But I guess I'm just so neurotic that I never go anywhere. I only ever think of packing my bags and going on holiday. I never go anywhere. There you go.
You don't go on holiday?
Yeah, I go on holidays. Yeah, I do go on holidays. I'm talking about major life decisions here. Like giving it all up, like you've done, Vanessa. No, but look, I mean, I've had opportunities over the years, including in the US, were an offer to come along that I think would be a major improvement on my current personal and professional circumstances, then I would accept it.
But now you run the psychology psychoanalysis program there, yeah?
No, I don't.
What do you do?
What do I do? You don't want to know. You don't want to know. And I'm not sure your listeners would want to know. No, the psychoanalysis program was closed down at Brunel.
No.
That's another story. And I still have a handful of PhD students who do work in psychoanalysis. But because I was recruited as a psychologist and because I have certificates that say that I am a psychologist, I can teach psychology. So I'm teaching psychology. But it's not psychoanalysis by no stretch of the imagination. Immediately after the psychoanalysis program was closed down, and that didn't involve me having to resign precisely because I've got an appointment in psychology and psychology is booming, including in the UK. But immediately after that, I was told to teach research methods, exactly the subject that almost prompted me to drop out of psychology altogether. I then ended up teaching because it's the kind of thing that no one else wants to teach, you see. Can I teach it? Yes. I still remember one of my students afterwards sending me a note saying it was a great pleasure to be taught by someone who is so knowledgeable about the subject and so enthusiastic about it. And I thought, yeah, I can probably fake a lot of things, including teaching research methods. So there you go. Can I teach it? Yes. Can I teach it enthusiastically? Well, seemingly. Do I like it? No. But there you go.
How many years ago did the psychoanalysis program close?
2 years ago.
Okay.
So it's still very fresh.
Yeah.
And it's not the only university where the psychoanalysis program closed. The psychoanalysis program at Kingston University closed. The psychoanalysis program at Middlesex University is about to close. So there's hardly anything left. Is that because there is no interest amongst students? No. There's actually quite a bit of interest amongst students. It is primarily because vice-chancellors, university senior management, and I was part of it for 12 years, come to the conclusion that there's more money to be found in either diverting resources towards undergraduate degrees, what we call undergraduate degrees, or diverting resources towards other kinds of master's programs that would then attract more student numbers. So to give you an example, we have at Brunel a master's in psychological sciences that does attract more students than I've ever had on my psychoanalysis degree, but it's a conversion course, you see. So it's a course that is designed for people who do not have a background in psychology and who want to improve their employability chances by just retraining to some extent as a psychologist. So by definition, that kind of program is likely to attract more students, okay? So, yeah, what can I say? Am I angry about it? Yeah, I'm fuming. I'm absolutely fuming. Am I going to be able to do anything about it? About me personally? No. But, so yeah. I'm not totally desperate.
It's so depressing, though.
I'm a happy pessimist, you see. The boat is sinking. It really is. We're all going down, but it shouldn't stop us from having a party. So I react to it most of the time with diabolical cynicism. And look, if anything is to change, it's not going to depend on the professors or the members of staff, because I don't know what it's like in the US, but in the UK, and I can say this without running the risk of your listeners exposing me as as a teenage terrorist or someone who has never given up on his rebellious ideas. No. Professors, members of staff are the baddies. I mean, there was a time that students were the baddies, and that the professors were seen as the protectors of law and order, and now it's exactly the way around. The professors are the baddies. If anything goes wrong, it's always our fault. I'm not just speaking for my institution, I'm speaking for other institutions as well. If a student fails, or actually we can't use that anymore because it's not politically correct anymore. Apparently students get really upset if you tell them that they fail. So you have to tell them that their success has been deferred, right? And so if a student's success has been deferred, whose fault is it? Well, it's the fault of the teacher, of the lecturer, of the professor, because the professor clearly has failed to appreciate those students' particular needs. So there you go. I can't hear you anymore, Vanessa. So
no, you can. I'm just speechless.
Okay, it's just because you're speechless. Yeah, it's our fault. It's our fault. So every so often I'm being asked to go to attend workshops about how I need to change, accommodate, tailor my teaching. And if their success is deferred, if there is a difference in the Derridian sense at the point of their success, then we are to blame.
So you have to coddle everyone.
We're the baddies. And that's why I'm saying, if anything is going to change, it will have to come from the students, not from us.
And why would the students want to be less coddled? That's never going to happen.
So we're doomed. We're doomed. The boat is sinking. The boat is sinking. Absolutely. We're all going down. I mean, I've written on how many other people have written on this, on how universities have just become extensions of the neoliberal economy, and how that has dramatically changed not only the curriculum, but every single aspect of university life. And some people have stated it much better than I stated now. But you see, it's not just universities who are to blame for that. It's a broader structure. But there you go.
No, exactly. It sounds like exactly when I was working in the hospital. Everything's about numbers and everything's about filling out paperwork for grants, and nothing is about actual treatment. It's like in universities, it's not about learning. It's about like production and what job you can get when you get out and that sort of thing. That's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, when I encourage my students to ask me questions about whatever it is I'm teaching, be it research methods, I rarely get questions about content or about one or the other aspect of the epistemology or the broader methodology that sits underneath the subject I'm teaching, but I always get questions about what exactly they need to learn so that they can pass their exam. So this is the instrumentalization, the radical instrumentalization of learning. And much like you have the instrumentalization of healthcare. So it's not about the treatment. It's about how quickly we can get you out of the hospital in a more or less satisfactory way, so that you can fit into the good statistic, and your clinic is being regarded as a highly performing clinic.
It's shocking. It is absolutely shocking. But that's the world we live in. But I'm a happy pessimist.
It's so depressing, though. But that's why I had to leave the hospital eventually, because I just couldn't take it anymore. But thinking about the fact that it's like that in the universities, it's like if even the places where people are supposed to learn to be able to think are only focused on production and like what passing the test and what job I can get, then like where are people ever going to learn to think? And how long has it been already that the people growing up now never even think about the fact that it was or could be any other way?
Yeah, I can't answer that question, but what I can say is, in all honesty, that kids definitely don't learn how to think critically at university anymore. I'm not even sure they still learn how to think. I mean, they learn how to get the most. They learn about efficiencies, effectiveness, and how to economize. They learn about the 3 E's, basically. That is to say, they learn about how to get the most out of their degree as quickly as possible in order for them to then contribute to the economy. That's what they learn. And it's incredibly tragic. It's hugely tragic. Now, what is even more tragic is that I'm then expected a lot of the time to adapt my teaching to what the students desire. I mean, we can look at this in Lacanian terms and talk about the students' desire and the institutional desire and the fantasy that underpins it. So I'm expected to adjust my teaching to what the students desire, but of course the students' desire is already filtered and mediated, contaminated, I could say, by the fact that they have been commodified on account of the economic process in which they have unconsciously started to participate. Yeah. I mean, one of the major issues that we had a couple of years ago here in 2012 is that, and I was still a senior manager myself then at the time, that from one year to the next, the university fees went up from £3,000 a year to £9,000 a year. Now, compared to what students pay in places like Harvard or Columbia, there's still peanuts, right? But from one year to the next, it went up. It tripled. And so we were very concerned about the fact that it would be a drop in applications, and there was a small drop, but not nearly as dramatic as we thought it was going to be. But then the next thing that we started to worry about is how this increased cost of higher education would transform the students' expectations, right? And it has transformed students' expectations, i.e., more and more students have come to see their education as a service that they purchase and that they have the right to criticize, like you would criticize the service that you receive in an expensive hotel that you've paid for during your holiday. So they evaluate the educational service that they receive in terms of the money that they paid for it. Now, that means that students have to some extent, self-identified not only as customers, but as consumers of higher education. But it's actually much worse than that. Yeah. It's much worse than that because apart from being consumers of higher education, they themselves, and they don't realize it, have been commodified by the system, by the broad neoliberal economic system that wants them to go through higher education as quickly as possible in order to then contribute to the economy as much as possible. By virtue of the skills, and that's the other thing that we haven't talked about, that by virtue of the skills that they've learned at university, because there's been a shift away from content-based teaching, let alone theory. I'm not sure what it's like in the US, but you're not really supposed to teach kids theory anymore. To them being taught skills, transferable skills, employability skills, that kind of thing. Yeah? So they are a commodity. They have been commodified, and I mean, you and I, and that's where my pessimism lies. I mean, you and I are not going to make a difference, but I still hope, I still have hope that maybe out there are some 18, 19 years olds who will say, we've had enough of this. We don't want to be like that. We don't want to do this. We want to know what it is to think critically about the world in which we live, because that's the only way in which we, as the future generation, will be able to make a difference. But look, maybe that's my fantasy or my illusion as well.
Yeah, but at least the teenagers are starting to rebel. I've been saying that for years, that like the teenagers had not been rebelling for a long time. They really hadn't. Like when I was teaching at university, it's like everybody was just like getting sushi and going to Chipotle and on their phones and taking Prozac, and there was like no aggression or anything. But at least like with the Parkland students and like Greta Thunberg here in Stockholm with the environment, like the real people that are speaking out are the teenagers again.
Well, that's what it takes. That's what it takes. I mean, the environment, I know, is now very much on kids' minds, and I think the work that Greta's doing is absolutely fantastic, and hopefully from kicking kids a new sense of conscience that is focused on the environment and ecological matters, one can also kick them a conscience that gets them to think critically about other aspects of their life.
Right, it's like they haven't even had an opportunity to think about that because the environment is seriously a catastrophe, and then like in America, people are just getting shot in school. So first they'll tackle that, and then maybe they'll think more about critical thinking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, no, but if you get them to think about the environment and how we need to do something about the environment now, if we do not want to be seen as the first living species that is responsible for its own complete self-extinction, then what's happening now is fantastic. But hopefully, I say, it will also lead to other things. I mean, hopefully it will create more awareness. But I hope that it's going to lead to other things, and that the younger generation might one day also, like they did in 1968, occupy the university and say, we've had enough. We've had enough. But the problem there is, to use the word that you used earlier, is that they're cuddled, you see, or at least they're told that they have the right, that they can claim the right, that they are entitled to expect a cuddle. I mean, even at the very level of the university discourse now, it's suffused with false, fake words of care that many kids obviously buy because they see it as evidence of a good quality service that they get. And in many institutions, you can't even refer to students anymore. So forget about what I said earlier on about being a failure and not being politically correct. I mean, there is now a gradual transition towards students not being politically correct anymore, because it is rumored that it inadvertently puts the learner into a passive place. So you need to talk about pills, partners in learning. As in the students have to be given the opportunity to participate in the construction of the curriculum so that they can feel not only that they are valued, but that they can contribute to what they're going to learn. Yeah, and it's fake. It's totally fake. Right? But that's how students' expectations are being shaped in order to then institutions to be better, or so they believe, at selling their service, you see. If you are being told, then you buy it, that you can participate in the service delivery, but in all likelihood you're going to be happier, even if the service that you get is total crap, because you will have been fooled into thinking that you had a hand in it.
Instead of there's amazing... I love this rant.
And as you can tell, well, apparently I'm ranting a lot. I got a fantastic review the other day of a paper on masculinity that I submitted to a journal. And I sent it to various people because it was the best review I ever got. I'm not sure I should read it out, but it's fantastic. So apparently I'm ranting a lot these days. But I think we need, we need people to stand up, and I think it's the youngsters that need to do it. So that's me rabble-rousing now, so, because it's their future, and they can make difference, and they probably feel less tired than me after a day's ranting.
We should talk about your psychoanalytic work too, though, because you're not just a research methods professor. You also are an amazing psychoanalyst.
Or someone who rants all the time about about how terrible the world is. I don't know. Maybe. What do you want to know?
What are you working on?
What am I working on? I always work on various projects at the same time. It's the only way. It's the only way that I can keep myself motivated. Intellectual promiscuity. If I'm bored with one project, I go to another project, and that's how I keep going. And I often find that the second project I'm working on inspires some of the stuff I'm doing on the first project. Okay, I will answer your question. I'm just about to finish a book with essays on the history of Freudian psychoanalysis. And I've always been interested in history because it allows me again to satisfy my probably insufficiently analyzed curiosities. So this is a book. It's going to be called, well, assuming the publisher wants it to be called, Freud in the Margins, Rethinking the History of Psychoanalysis. And I'm just about to finish it and send it off. And it's basically a collection of essays in which I look at various episodes in the history of psychoanalysis, but it's restricted here to Freud and his followers, to use the title of Paul Rosen's book, to look at the history of psychoanalysis in a different way, and looking at it in a different way is essentially applying a different methodology. And I don't claim originality for this at all, but basically I apply the methodology of psychoanalysis to the history of psychoanalysis. And by the methodology of psychoanalysis, I mean this, and this has always caught my attention, again, because it satisfies my insufficiently analyzed curiosity. But you will remember that at one point I hope I'm not going to say something stupid now, but even if I do, who cares? At one point in the Moses of Michelangelo, in Freud's essay, the Moses of Michelangelo, Freud compares the work of an analyst to the work of a late 19th century art scholar called Giovanni Morelli, who at the time was famous for inventing a new technique for differentiating between an authentic master and a fake. And Morelli said, there's a much better technique for differentiating a master from a fake than looking at the general composition of the painting. You need to look at the tiny little details, because it's often in the tiny little details that fraudulent painters, those who want to copy the great masters, make mistakes. And Freud, in an essay, says, in a sense, the analyst does exactly the same. So we pay attention to what falls out of the analysand's coherent, consistent discourse. We pay attention to what appears in the margin, to the trifles. We pay attention to the rubbish heap of our observations, right? So I applied this method to various episodes in the history of psychoanalysis. And I might give you an example if you want me to, but I hope that in doing so, and inevitably the book is not a comprehensive history of psychoanalysis. I mean, how could it be? That would defy the whole purpose, you know. So it's a series of rereadings, but I hope that in doing so, I shed light on aspects of Freud as a man, as a scholar, as an analyst, and aspects of the psychoanalytic movement that have hitherto not been appreciated or haven't been sufficiently valued. So that's what I'm doing. That's one of the things I'm doing.
What's an example?
Okay, let me think of a good example. I'll give you an example that I've been talking about in Vienna recently, and in various other places. And it's a controversial example because it involves a patient, and it involves someone who's actually a public figure. So, to cut a long and complicated story short, and that will be in the book, assuming that it'll get published, but it probably will, he says, with a certain degree of self-confidence. Early 1930s, someone called Alice of Battenberg, who is Princess Alice of Battenberg, who is the mother-in-law of Queen Elizabeth II. So the current queen, you know her, everyone knows her, Queen Elizabeth II, is married to the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip. His mother had a mental breakdown. Right. I'll spare you the details as to the circumstance. She had a mental breakdown. And she was sent to what was at the time the only residential psychoanalytic treatment center in Europe. And it was called Sanatorium, Kurhaus, Schloss Tegel. It was a short drive from the center of Berlin, and it was run by a colleague of Freud's called Ernst Simmel. Now, someone whose work I love and who I consider to be a friend has written a fantastic book called Freud's Free Clinics, Elizabeth Danto, you may know. So she talks a little bit about the Sanatorium Schloss Tegel, but she doesn't talk about this particular case. When Princess Alice arrived, and the reason why, what I'm writing about is it's not controversial, but it's sensitive. It's because this is a royal, and her descendants are still alive, of course. But what I can say to you has been cleared, so I'm not going to say anything that will get me into trouble. When she arrived, she was in a right state. I mean, I imagine her in the same state as Keira Knightley was in David Cronenberg's famous portrayal of Sabine Spielrein. When you remember this, when she arrives at the Buchholzli to be treated by Carl Gustav Jung. So she was in a right state. So much so that at one point, Ernst Simmel consults with Sigmund Freud. And he says to Sigmund Freud, what am I going to do with it? What am I going to do with this woman? And Freud says something that no psychoanalyst who is in their right mind, including, I hope, this one here, would be able to make sense of. He said to Simmel, I strongly recommend that her ovaries are exposed to high-intensity X-rays. Period. So what do you do with that? Right? So what do you do with that? So this is my trifle. Yeah? So this is my little Freudian advice that doesn't fit into the picture. Yeah? Because when you read it for the first time, you think, well, I mean, it's hardly a psycholytic intervention, right? Exposing a woman's ovaries to high-intensity X-rays. You think, well, why on earth would Freud have said that? Yeah. So this is the kind of event, you could say, that is disturbing, it's disruptive, it is nonsensical, it potentially undermines everything you've always known about Freud. But for me, and it's one of about 10 examples in my book, for me it prompted what has now been quite a long, I think a year-long process of research into the circumstances. And it means that you have to delve into archives, you have to look at contextual factors surrounding the admission of Princess Alice that could possibly explain why Freud said this. Now, I'm not going to give you the whole story because, you have to read the book. But the conclusion is, I will give you parts of the conclusion, that when it came to treating patients, or especially patients of whom Freud thought that they were psychotic, that Freud was not nearly as wedded to the efficacy of psychoanalysis as most of his followers believed. It means that Freud was willing to experiment. It means that Freud was prepared to expose patients to interventions that were biological, that were physical, to interventions whose efficacy had not been proven. It means that Freud, in the best of cases, was actually much more creative, especially with psychotic patients, than you could think he was. Or in the worst of cases, it meant that Freud had absolutely no reservations, especially with psychotic patients, to actually see them being treated in a radically non-psycholytic way. In this case, with a technique that had no proven efficacy for psychotic disorders, that did result in Princess Alice becoming sterile because her ovaries were effectively destroyed, etc., etc. And so, I have a lot of these events, these trifles, that have generally been written out of the history of psychoanalysis and that allow you to paint a different picture of Freud, the man of the psychoanalytic community, etc., etc. So that's what it's all about. But you have to wait for the book to come out to read the rest of the story. And another project I've actually recently finished. I just handed it in. It's not a book. It's a long essay. I've just handed in a long essay on the work of Francis Bacon, not the philosopher, but the painter. Because the estate of Francis Bacon is about to launch a new book series called Francis Bacon Studies, and one of the books they wanted to do was Francis Bacon, Psychoanalysis and Philosophy. And so I spent a good 6 months of my life, because that's what I do, you see. I become totally obsessed with the subject. And I would spend all my day, every day, reading every single book or every single text about Francis Bacon that I could possibly lay my hands on. And then when it's finished, I obviously sink into a deep depression. Now, that's not entirely true. But, for 6 months, I've been totally obsessed by Francis Bacon. And I actually discovered, here's another trifle for you. I actually discovered that Francis Bacon owned a copy of Lacan's Écrits. But I have not been able to lay my hands on it because it has miraculously disappeared. How good is that? So there's a picture of Francis Bacon's studio, and if you look at it, it's obviously not Bruce Sphinx's translation because by 2006 Francis Bacon had already died. But Francis Bacon, who died in 1992, owned a copy of Alan Sheridan's. You probably know the book. The silver cover, right? The Selected Écrits. It sits there on a commode next to his bed, right? And all the other books on that commode are now in the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin. I mean, there's reasons for that, right? So apart from this one. So the Lacan has disappeared. I'll tell you if I ever find it, but why would it disappear? Why would it disappear? And if Francis Bacon read Lacan, which paper would he have read?
That's amazing. That makes me so happy.
Yeah, oh, does it?
I love Francis Bacon. They had an exhibition of his work at the Met, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, and it had 52 of his paintings. And after seeing 52 of his paintings, I literally found myself wandering around Manhattan. And then after like an hour, I was like, where am I going? I don't even know what I'm doing. I was just like stunned.
I mean, the effect it has on you is extraordinary. I mean, the argument that I make in the paper, you didn't ask me the question, but I'm going to tell you anyway, and then we can shift subjects if you want. But the argument I make in the paper, because what I absolutely hate, is people who take psychoanalysis, especially Lacan, as a little toolbox that opens every door and that behind this door reveals secret meaning. So I hate it. I think it's facile. I think Derrida was spot on when he said at the very beginning of his critique on Lacan's reading of the Purloined Letter. As you know, it's in the postcard where he says, when psychoanalysis sets out to find something, it only ever finds itself. La psychanalyse se trouve. So I think he's right up to a point that if you take the Lacanian toolbox and you use it to read, I don't know. I mean, the number of times I've read Lacanian readings of Black Swan, I mean, it makes me want to vomit. So I did not want to do that. Because it really goes against everything I stand for. So I thought I'm going to try and do something different. And then the question is, well, what do you want to do? What can you do? And what I decided to do in the end was, I have a fondness for Lacan's paper Littérature from the early 1970s, which, as you know, I've been known to even impersonate on occasion. But Lacan says something interesting, puzzling in that text about Joyce. He says in the very beginning of that text, he says, when it came to littering the letter, and that's Joyce's pun rather than Lacan's pun. When it comes to making litter of the letter in Finnegan's Wake, but also to some extent already in Ulysses, Joyce arrived at the best one could expect from an analysis at its end. And because of that, he didn't need psychoanalysis. And, I mean, whatever that means in its own right, I thought, well, could we possibly extend something like that to the work, and I do mean the work, the activity, the creative activity of painting. So the paper I did for and the book will come out later this year for Francis Bacon studies, doesn't really look at any of Francis Bacon paintings, and even less involves an interpretation or a Lacanian interpretation of one or the other painting, say the triptych or the crucifixion, but it looks at his process, at his creative activity. And I try to think of it as what could... I'm trying to think of it in terms of whether it could be looked at as a painting cure, as an analytic process through painting, which, again, I'm not sure is wildly original, because the surrealists, I mean, and I know you're interested in the cut-up technique and in surrealist techniques for accessing the unconscious, but basically, I thought that maybe we could do something with what Francis Bacon had to say, and he had to say a lot because he was quite garrulous, almost more garrulous than I am, when it came to talking about his work. I thought that maybe we could do something about what Francis Bacon had to say about his painting process in terms of the parallel with the cyclitic process. As a result of which, you could say, as Lacan said about Joyce, he didn't need to go into analysis because he was never in analysis, because through his painting, which, as you know, is quite repetitive and constructive and reconstructive, in the sense you could say he was always painting the same thing, he arrived at the best that one could possibly arrive at in analysis, the clinical process. So that's what it's all about. But it took me 6 months to put it together because the literature on Francis Bacon is absolutely enormous. I mean, it's gargantuan. And my symptom does not allow me to write anything without me feeling that I've actually that I've done justice, I should probably say. Good scholars as we both are, it's called a literature review, Vanessa, right? So you do a literature review. So I thought, let me have a look at what Lacanian scholars have done about Francis Bacon. And lo and behold, I came across a paper by Pierre-Gilles Guéguin. And then, but before long, you think, well, he should be ashamed of himself because from beginning to end, it is full of factual and it's not me saying this because I'm arrogant. And just, it's what you would say when you read an undergraduate essay: do your homework. Right? But of course, if you then do your homework, it takes a long time. So. Because the literature in this case is so voluminous, but I don't know. I mean, I've spoken to Bacon scholars about it because that's the other thing I felt I had to do. I don't consider myself to be a Bacon scholar, so you have to take the responsibility and make sure that if you make an interpretation of Francis Bacon work, that you actually inform yourself about what the real experts have to say. And apparently they thought it was good enough. So, so there you go.
I'd love to read that. I'd love to read both of those books.
The Bacon work is not a book. It's just an extended essay. But it'll be a book on Francis Bacon, psychoanalysis and philosophy. And so those are two projects I've been working on. And then, there's a couple of other things. I thought I would get a paper on masculinity published, but as I said earlier on, the reviewers really didn't like it.
Why didn't they like it?
Well, they thought, I'm not going to read out the review. They thought it was just an extensive rant. And that didn't make sense at all. I mean, I've long given up on the idea that peer review is a fully fair, transparent process. A wonderful writer wrote something about it in the London Review of Books. Stefan Collini, I think, wrote about it, the peer review process in the London Review of Books recently, and it was spot on. Of course, it's not double blind. Of course, you're not being reviewed by peers, because were your peers to review you, the review process would probably take 3 years because your peers would be busy I say all the time when I'm being asked for reviews, I'm just too busy to review other people's work. As a result of which, most of the time, you're actually reviewed by people who are not your peers at all. Double-blind peer review is by no means the gold standard that the academic community thinks it is. I mean, that's an illusion. It's a fantasy. The system is entirely bankrupt. Now, I'm not saying that because I was rejected. Not at all. And I've written pieces over the years that really shouldn't have been published and were published anyway, and others that shouldn't have been published because they were incredibly, incredibly bad. I'm saying that because the system doesn't work. And look, I mean, we don't have to carry on with this, but another problem with it is that you obviously, with this type of process, you always have a tendency towards the middle. You have a tendency towards the common denominator. I mean, let's face it. I don't think that the majority of Freud's papers would ever have gotten published if they'd been sent through the blind peer review process. I
think about that all the time. And the fact that he just has opinions and says what he thinks, and then he's like, I'm going to say something different next time because, that's how people think about things. Like, this would never have gotten published now.
But think about all the people that you and I read in psychoanalysis or continental philosophy. Would Derrida have gotten his paper published? No, of course not. I mean, Lacan, definitely. I mean, no way Lacan would ever get a paper published. Agamben? I don't think so. Deleuze? No, absolutely not. So the papers that get published in peer-reviewed journals are most of the time papers that people can't be bothered reading anymore because they don't contain anything terribly original or terribly exciting. And as a result of which, I mean, that's the whole drama of the business behind it. You have all these journals publishing stuff after having gone through this process that is just going to disappear in the creases of history before long.
Well, that's a good point then. It's not very original because, they're constantly, I mean, the paper I read the other day was like every other sentence was a quote from somebody else, and it was just like piecing together all these quotes and citations. And I was like, by the time I got through it, it was an interesting idea that the writer had, but it was like really hard to get what he was saying because he was so concerned with citing things every other sentence. And it's like, why didn't you say what you think, put some citations in so people know where to look, and that's it. But it's like they can't say what they think. They have to justify what they say every step.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if one of the peer reviewers said that the author in this question had to tone down his original thinking, had to substantiate it, but as a result of it, you get what I call a tendency towards the middle, a convergence towards the common denominator. As a result of which, you read it and you think, oh, well, it's all right, but I stopped reading most psychoanalytic journals a long time ago. I
haven't read them in years.
Every so often you do come across an interesting paper that you think, actually, that's really, cutting edge. And that's probably one that slipped through the nets of the peer review system or something like that. But most of the time you think, I guess
I read just people I know at this point. I'm like, what's so-and-so doing? What's so-and-so doing? And I just have been reading people I'm familiar with.
Exactly. But anyway, that was probably me ranting again.
I love ranting. I think we need more ranting.
Well, if you want a rant, I can give you one, Vanessa.
So where do people find you? Are you doing any talks or conferences or anything?
Oh dear, where did they find me?
Yeah.
Well, given that I always pack my bags and never go on a holiday, they can come and find me in London if they want. What have I got coming up?
At the Freud Museum?
Look, thankfully, I think the first talk I've got coming up is going to be on Francis Bacon. And that's going to be on the 8th of June, whatever the first weekend of June is, here in London, Centre for Freudian Analysis and Research. For reasons I do not understand at all, I've been asked to give a keynote at the International Neuropsychoanalysis Conference in Brussels in July. And so I'm going to delve into Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality again, and see if there's anything that falls out of the picture that could possibly be of interest to neuropsychoanalysts. We're doing an event again on comedy and psychoanalysis. I'm going to be plugging someone else's event here, but I love doing that because forget about me blowing my own trumpet. You need to blow other people's trumpet. So we got an event coming up at the Freud Museum sometime in May on psychoanalysis and comedy, which should be good fun.
How did you start working at the Freud Museum, running the Freud Museum?
God, how much time have you got left? My tenure at the Freud Museum has now come to an end, but I did it 4 years, and that was fine. It's a long story. A good friend of mine, Lisa Apignanesi, happened to sit on one of the panels I organized at a literature festival a couple of years ago, and we started talking, as you do, about Freud and psychoanalysis. That's what you talk about. And before long, she said that she wanted to step down and as the chair of the Freud Museum. And I thought, I've always loved the Freud Museum because it's history. It's a shrine. It's a kind of place where you go to go on a pilgrimage and so I've loved it, always loved it. So I had the opportunity to take on that role, and I'll spare the details. Before long, I was in the seat of the chair of the Freud Museum, and I think running a small charity like that, because it is a small charity organization, we don't get any money from the government at all, is a challenge. I had some experience, and we don't need to go back to that, working as a senior manager at the university, but not in a charity, although universities in this country are also considered to be a charity, but they have a special status. So it was a challenge because small budget, difficult to fundraise. It's not like in the US where psychoanalysts are more than happy to donate in their last will and testament, or all their movable and immovable assets to the society in which they train. So that we don't get that here. But I think that during the time of my tenure, I would hope that during the time of my tenure, we've enhanced, we've broadened our range of activities. That's actually the first thing I wanted to do. That I said, look, we need to make sure that we organize our events in such a way that we can attract a very broad constituency of people, i.e. young and old, psychoanalytic practitioners and experts, but also people who don't know anything about psychoanalysis. So we really need to widen our catchment area, and I hope that it's happened. But so yeah, I was plugging someone else's event. So we're doing something on psychoanalysis and comedy in May, and as you'll see, there's lots of other stuff going on at the Freud Museum in which I do not participate, but that is nonetheless really exciting.
No, it's great to see. There's always events there, and they post them on their own podcast as well. Yeah, I love listening to them that way.
That's right. Absolutely. I forgot. I'm also giving I shall appear briefly at the IPA conference in London in the summer. So it's a conference on the feminine, And I was asked by a very good friend of mine, Jill Gentile, whom you may know, to contribute to a panel. And if you're as neurotic as I am, you just can't say no. So I said yes, and so I'll be at the IPA conference in July as well, which is great.
Yeah, no, Jill's great. She contributed a chapter to the Rendering Unconscious book on hate speech.
Oh, did she? Ah, right. Fantastic. Yeah. Well, there's hate speech and hate speech, obviously. So part of me feels like saying there's not enough of it, but we need to define what hate is first before we think about that. But again, to answer your previous question, later this year, if all goes well, there's a second ACRE conference in Pittsburgh. So following on from the conference that took place in Ghent last year, my good friend Derek Hook and Callum Neal and Steen van Hul and Bruce Fink joined hands to do the second ACRE conference, which will coincide with the publication in English of Lacan's Seminar 6 on Desire, and the publication in English of the second volume of Reading ACRE. So, touch wood, if my abstract is accepted, I'll talk a bit more about ACRE in Pittsburgh as well.
Nice.
That's enough. That's enough for me.
Yeah, that's
enough.
Good.
That's enough for me. That's more than enough. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have a website or anything, or should I just post links to all of these different events?
No, I don't have a website at all. I hate it.
I'll organize it for you. Then you'll have everything in one place.
If you want to create a website for me, if someone else out there...
No, just for the podcast episode.
I'll tell you something. I'll tell you something funny. I used to have a PA, lovely personal assistant, and at one point she set me up on Twitter, she set me up on Facebook, and on LinkedIn. It was hell. It was absolute hell. I mean, I already on average get about 300 emails every day. That's not junk. That's just like proper emails. I got emails from all around the world saying, "People, can I please be your friend?" And I just it was. But what's most interesting is that she asked me for a picture, and I sent her a picture in my rock star outfit, because all this academia, Lacan stuff, that's just something I do on the side. I don't really want to do that. Most of the time, I just want to play music. So I sent her a picture, which I think is still on the Twitter feed. And someone said to me the other day, just the day before yesterday, that apparently there's a rumor going on that it's not really me. Well, guys out there, I can tell you, it's me. It's me. It is me. So I sent her a picture, and I said, here's a picture for in this case for LinkedIn. And she's like, no, you can't put that there. You can't put that there. People are not going to take you seriously anymore. And I remember saying, that has always been the last thing I've ever worried about. And the day I'm taking myself so seriously that I can only talk about serious things in a serious way, you should either call an ambulance or the police.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Professor DANY NOBUS. For more, please visit our website, renderingunconscious.org, or my website, drvanessasinclair.net. The zeitgeist creating anyone who timeless rituals found in Tibetan, Nepalese, West repetition is unexact. Creates small deviations, differences where change may come into play. Small cuts, spaces that open potential for something new, which then in turn alter the system. In this light, repetition may be seen as the scaffolding of being widely known that these practices are happening here and now, reflecting the juxtaposition of content present within the dynamic unconscious. What is often under-recognized is that exchange for a limited edge, we have to look during the same time period and within the very cultural and intel, then we too can birth the field of all skies. I write across the picture, a methodology fundamentally mirror and make use of unconscious processes, and often the more process-oriented techniques later utilized by affects how people treat me. I was thinking from a view of direction, from a point of view of a third mind and work. Do you get sort of insights and ideas and epiphanies that are so drives? At this point, Freud was solely focused on libido. In 1920, their holy son. Further along the lines of Eros and Thanatos, adding the concept of the death drive too. There has been much debate as to the exact origins of good homes. Ally, the movement has not been given its proper place in art history. This year, this has finally begun to shift, and Dada is beginning to receive an cognition it deserves. One might even view the difficulty art historians have displayed in defining Dark Horse, highlighting the premise of the movement itself, accentuating its resistance to definition, systemization, and categorization, a resistance reflective of the human unconscious and sexuality, which subvert normalization and classification. Proponents of new ways of thinking, although these sequences are intended to be imaginary, no materials, distinction, either in the picture or in the sound is made. Writing, the cut-up, performance, and chants. They created various manifestos and publications, influenced by the constant change, publishing and distributing their own manifestos as early as 1909. And all of these areas are promoted provocation in art and performance, often commenting on contemporary Western society, industrialization, technology, youth, and violence, while keeping an eye towards the future. Writing in Arts magazine, rituals, transgressive occurrences, they're your own answers. Originator of Dada. Picabia began then, but they're usually not constructed, darling. Abstract reminds me that separation completed in Babylon principle, where essence does, or work fits in perfectly. Avant-garde musician who remains in which we strengthen the totality by written in throughout his career, which posits that it was the organism and strengthened the must be awakened is exactly the energy with girl we couldn't get. The teeth are one thing, they're a physical trait, but they come on baby, light. Stuff you've done touches upon more complicated aspects that have disintegration in the concept of art. Soon after, effectivity, the movement. 4 works for the 1913 Armory Show bring in a 2x3 item of their choosing in the United States. The coachman does so, raising Severine's arm in the an arch, the new world, air, then goes behind the tree trunk to make the rope fast. Her, that of break, delivered the artists and intellectuals from the obsession of the.